HOA called it community property. I called it my grandfather's lake. The HOA brought jet skis, rental booths, and noise claiming legal rights they never had. They didn't know I had a clause buried in the deed, and federal law on my side. By the time they realized it was too late, every wave they made built their own downfall. Now the lake is protected forever, and their summer empire illegally erased. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. If you ever sat by my lake in the fall, you'd hear the rustle of golden leaves slipping into the water, like little secrets drifting downstream. There's no traffic out here, just the warble of red-winged blackbirds and the occasional splash of a turtle dropping off a sun-warmed log. The air smells like pine and old cedar, and in the mornings, mist hovers above the surface like the lake is exhaling. It's quiet, steady, the kind of place that remembers. I grew up on this land. The farmhouse, about 300 feet up the hill from the shoreline, used to be my grandfather's. He built it with his own hands in 1962, back when this whole stretch was just farmland and trees. He used to say the lake didn't belong to us. It trusted us. I never understood that until I got older. When I was a kid, he'd take me fishing at dawn, launching his old rowboat from a crumble wooden dock that only he could navigate without falling in. We'd sit in silence for hours, watching the fog lift, waiting for trout to bite. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was usually about protecting the land. I didn't know the full story until years after he passed. Apparently, in the late 70s, the county tried to rezone this area. There was a proposal to convert this whole basin, including our lake, into a landfill overflow site. He fought it tooth and nail, filed injunctions, rallied neighbors, even went to court. In the end, he won. The county backed off, and the lake stayed untouched. I found all the court documents in a cedar chest in the attic after he died. He never bragged about it, just quietly defended what he loved. When I inherited the property, I moved into the farmhouse full-time. Remote job, no kids, single, nothing holding me to the city. And truthfully, I needed the lake more than I realized. Life had gotten loud and brittle. Up here, I remembered how to breathe. The lake was just as I remembered it. Loons nesting in the reeds, herons lifting off with their slow, prehistoric wings. I started planting native flowers along the bank, restoring the old walking path, even got a trail cam to track deer. No motorboats, no trash, no crowds, just quiet. That peace lasted about 2 years. Then came the development. They called it Clearwater Ridge, a name so ironic it almost felt intentional. Slick brochures, pastel homes, eco-modern amenities. The kind of neighborhood that promises mountain views and yoga on the lawn, but comes with 30-page rulebooks about grass length and mailbox color. Within 6 months, the lots sold out. New neighbors arrived in Teslas and Range Rovers. A freshly formed homeowners association began dropping notices in my mailbox, even though my property was technically outside their border.
I ignored them at first.
Then came the meetings. Then came the suggestion that the lake should be opened up for broader recreational use. I laughed when I first read that, out loud. Sitting on the porch, coffee in hand, staring at the same body of water that had carried my grandfather's ashes the year he passed. Broader recreational use? This lake had one dock, no boat launch, and a single gravel road to access it. It wasn't a theme park. But the HOA wasn't joking. And I was about to find out just how far they'd go. The thing is, this lake, it's not just water, it's not just a view, or a shared space, or some scenic perk for weekend paddleboarders. It's blood memory, it's war won quietly, it's my inheritance, not just in deed, but in duty. My grandfather gave up years of his life fighting to keep this lake whole. They were about to learn I inherited more than just the land. It started with a sound that didn't belong. A high-pitched mechanical whine like a wasp on steroids. I was trimming the edge of the path down by the dock when I heard it. Distant at first, but getting closer. Then came the roar. A blur shot across the lake, kicking up white spray and sending a ripple that crashed against the dock. A jet ski. I froze, weed trimmer humming in my hand. For a second, I thought maybe I'd lost track of where I was. Maybe someone had taken a wrong turn, but then another one appeared. Then two more, yellow, red, black, like carnival toys, skimming over glass. The water, once mirror still, was now a churn of waves and oily streaks. They kept circling, weaving in and out, some with kids shouting from the backs. I waved, tried yelling. No one even looked my way. When I walked up to the trailhead the next morning, there was a sign staked into the ground. Clearwater Ridge Community Water Access, HOA members only. And below it, in smaller print, for guest rentals and jet ski scheduling, visit the leasing office. Leasing office? I walked the perimeter of the lake twice that day. I didn't find a dock, I found two. One was nailed into the far edge of the lake where the newer home sat, with a kayak rack and a laminated price list. The other was a temporary floating platform with rope bumpers and fuel drums chained beside it. It hit me like a body blow. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was intentional. That night, I showed up at the next HOA meeting. I wasn't on the agenda, but I didn't care. I sat in the back until they got to new business, then raised my hand. The room was filled with neatly dressed residents, sipping flavored water and chatting about pool maintenance schedules. When the board president, a man named Daryl Kinsley, a retired dentist with the charisma of drywall, called on me, I stood up. I need to ask who authorized jet ski rentals on my lake. The room quieted. Daryl adjusted his glasses. I'm sorry, your lake? Yes, I said, jaw tight. The lake adjacent to my property. Parcel 3C, registered as a private water body since 1965. My family has owned that land and that lake since before this neighborhood was a blueprint. He gave a tight, rehearsed smile. The HOA has conducted a legal rezoning assessment and obtained provisional easements to designate the lake as a community access recreational water feature. I blinked. You what? He leaned on the podium, as if rehearsing for a courtroom he'd never actually stood in. After reviewing land records and water use policy, our legal consultants submitted paperwork to classify the lake as an underutilized shared environmental feature. The county assessor's office confirmed there was no active restriction on shared use, and because multiple properties abut the waterline, it qualifies as a multi-resident amenity. The room nodded like this was a TED Talk on suburban expansion. I nearly laughed. So you filed paperwork to say the lake was underused, and that magically made it yours? No, he said calmly. It made it ours. That word stuck in my head like a splinter. Ours. I left the meeting before they could vote on whether to add paddleboard yoga on Sunday mornings. Back home, I pulled every document I had. The deed, the plat map, the handwritten letter from my grandfather outlining the boundaries. But when I called the county clerk, I hit the wall. We received a reclassification notice 3 months ago. You were listed as an adjacent property owner, not a primary stakeholder. Primary stakeholder. They'd redrawn the lines. They'd cited some obscure clause in the Land Management Code about interconnected riparian zones and non-commercial underdevelopment. They'd made the argument that since the lake wasn't actively being monetized or protected for ecological purposes, it was a candidate for shared beneficial recreational usage. And somehow, it had gone through. In their eyes, my silence had looked like neglect. And now, under that loophole, they were renting out my lake by the hour to anyone with a credit card and a driver's license. I stood at the water's edge that evening and watched as a group of teenagers zipped across the surface. One of them tossed a soda can off the back. It floated, bobbing near the reeds where turtles used to sunbathe. I could feel something unspool inside me, not anger, not even rage. Something colder, more focused. They saw the lake as a toy. I knew better. Because what they didn't realize was that lakes remember, and I was about to remind them. I stayed quiet after the jet skis. Too quiet by their standards. They must have thought I'd accepted defeat, just another bitter holdout on the edge of their suburban kingdom. But the thing is, I grew up around farmers, not fighters. People who didn't shout, didn't swing, but never forgot a boundary line. And they sure as hell didn't roll over when someone tried to redraw one. So I started where any battle worth fighting should begin. In the paperwork. I pulled out the original deed, yellowing at the edges, brittle in spots, and laid it across the dining table. I hadn't looked at it closely in years. My grandfather had filed it himself before I was even born. And tucked there in the smallest font I'd ever seen, wedged between two property easements, was a clause I didn't remember reading before. Water body protected in perpetuity for non-commercial, conservation-compatible usage. My grandfather had written that clause in himself. The notary's stamp was official. The language was broad, but purposeful. He wasn't just fighting the landfill back then. He was future-proofing the lake. That was my crack in the dam. I needed confirmation, so I called Walt. Walt Matheson used to work for the county as a land surveyor. Retired now, mostly tinkered with old maps and lived off a pension and a stubborn sense of duty. He knew my grandfather, said the old man once saved his dog from drowning. I remember that lake, Walt said. Knew it had something special. What are you looking for exactly? Proof it's not just water, I said. Proof it's alive. He showed up 3 days later with a truckload of topographic overlays, land use maps, and survey equipment that looked older than both of us. We spent the weekend walking the perimeter, measuring runoff, mapping silt layers, cataloging plant growth patterns. He muttered a lot, took notes in a notebook that had duct tape for a spine. I'll tell you this, he said, pushing his cap back on his head. This lake feeds more than just nostalgia. You've got a shallow water basin with rich biosilt and native vegetation. It's what we used to call a fringe wetland. That was the first time the word wetland came up, and it stuck. Next, I reached out to someone I hadn't talked to since college. Marcy Klein, who now worked for an environmental nonprofit and had a reputation for showing up to zoning board meetings with inconvenient data and full-color charts. I sent her pictures, soil samples, a clipped audio recording of a bird call I couldn't identify. She called me at midnight the next day, breathless. "Do you know what you have?" she said. "No," I said. "But I'm starting to suspect it's more than just water." She confirmed what Walt suspected. This wasn't just a pond or a pretty water feature. The lake qualified as a seasonal wetland habitat. Even more critical, it was hosting 2 migratory bird species protected under federal law. One of them, a speckled reed warbler, was on a watch list. And better still, your photos show egg clusters, she said, which means active nesting. That changed everything. I started documenting everything. Dated photos, time-lapse footage of bird migration, soil pH readings. We logged the calls, mapped out amphibian tunnels. Marcy even found evidence of northern dusky salamander larvae, an endangered amphibian with habitat protection triggers under state and federal conservation statutes. I made copies of everything, stored one set in the cloud, printed another, bought a waterproof field notebook, and logged my observations every day like a scientist preparing for trial. The HOA had no idea. While they were out hosting paddleboard races and sending out newsletters about the next Lakefest weekend, I was quietly building a case that could freeze their entire operation, and they wouldn't see it coming. Because they didn't see me. They saw an old property line, a stubborn loner with a porch swing and a faded flannel shirt. They didn't know I had a paper trail older than their bylaws and allies who could read the language they'd chosen to ignore. They forgot this lake had been protected once before. And this time, the defense wasn't going to be a courtroom. It was going to be federal. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't even knock on another neighbor's door. Instead, I filed Form 11B petition for wetland evaluation and protection through the State Environmental Protection Agency's online portal. It was quiet, simple. A few fields to fill, a document upload button, and a summary box that asked, "Why do you believe this area qualifies for wetland protection?" I attached everything, photos of the nesting birds, the salamander larvae, the topographic overlays Walt had mapped by hand. I included Marcy's annotated field report, our wildlife logs, a full seasonal behavior table, and at the very bottom, a scanned copy of my grandfather's deed with that single buried sentence circled in red. Water body protected in perpetuity for non-commercial, conservation-compatible usage. Then I clicked Submit. That was it. No dramatic send-off. No gotcha email. Just a confirmation number and a timestamp. The silence that followed was the good kind. The kind that comes before something big. Like standing in the woods before a storm breaks. You can feel it before you see it. Meanwhile, the HOA was on a roll. The next morning, they erected a 30-foot vinyl banner at the lake's north end. Welcome to Clearwater Lake Days. Jet ski, grill, paddleboard, dance. The words looked absurd against the backdrop of nesting birds and still water. By the following weekend, they were charging $25 per car at the gravel pull-off, staffed by 2 teenagers in HOA-branded polos. Someone had even built a pop-up snack bar, complete with soda fridges, a Bluetooth speaker blaring top 40 hits, and a clipboard sign-up sheet for jet ski time slots. I watched from the bluff above the lake, coffee in hand, not saying a word. Let them have their fun.
Let them print flyers.
Sell bottled water. Hand out neon wristbands to guests like they were running a state fair. Because they missed one thing. The form. About a week after I submitted the petition, I got a call. Unknown number, calm voice. This is Michelle Dupree with the Environmental Impact and Compliance Division. We've reviewed your submission. I'd like to schedule a site visit. She asked if it could be discreet. No, HOA notification. Just her, me, and the land. Of course, I said. The birds don't like an audience. She chuckled. Michelle arrived in an unmarked government sedan at 6:45 a.m., 2 days later, dressed like a hiker, clipboard in one hand, state-issued camera in the other. We spent 4 hours walking the perimeter. She documented water levels, identified plants I didn't even have names for, and nodded slowly when we spotted the reeds rustling. One of the nesting warblers fluttering just inside. This is more active than I expected, she said. You weren't exaggerating. I said nothing. Just handed her a thermos of black coffee and let her listen to the quiet. Before she left, she said something I'll never forget. If this qualifies, and it's looking like it does, it won't just slow them down. It'll freeze them. I didn't smile, but I felt it. Deep down, the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing your trap is already set, and your enemy doesn't even see it. Let them keep dancing. They were already standing on thin ice. The first letter came in a cream envelope with gold lettering across the top. Clearwater Ridge Homeowners Association. Compliance Committee. I didn't even open it at first. I tossed it on the kitchen counter like junk mail. But curiosity and something colder got the better of me. Inside was a formal notice accusing me of trespassing. On my own land. They claimed I had entered the recreational perimeter during scheduled community hours, disrupting approved lakefront activity. They warned that repeated offenses could result in escalated community discipline procedures, including but not limited to revocation of neighborhood privileges. The language was bureaucratic, calculated, but the message was clear: stay quiet, stay gone. I thought it was a mistake at first. Then came the second letter. Then the third. Each one more aggressive than the last. Allegations of verbal disruption, boundary violation, and my personal favorite, impeding community morale. They had flipped the script, turned the quiet one, the one restoring the trail, protecting the birds, into a problem. Then came the flyers. They showed up in mailboxes, taped to light poles, even pinned to the HOA's little community bulletin board by the pool. Printed in bold red font with my name in all caps. Community alert. Local resident refuses to cooperate with HOA's safety measures. Homeowner blocks access to lakefront improvements. Unauthorized trail use under review. They made me sound like an arsonist. Neighbors I'd waved to for years suddenly avoided eye contact. Some pulled their dogs close when I passed. A few offered fake smiles, the kind that never touched their eyes. I became something whispered about at driveway gatherings, glanced at through shuttered blinds. The same people who'd once asked to take photos of the ducks near my dock now acted like I was the disease in their perfect ecosystem. I'd be lying if I said it didn't get to me. One night, I walked down to the edge of the water, sat on the bench I built with my grandfather, and just stared at the black glass of the lake. It didn't feel like mine anymore. The stillness had changed. The water seemed nervous, like it was waiting for something too. That's when I found the watch. I hadn't worn it in years. His old Timex, scratched at the edges, the leather strap cracked but still holding. It was tucked in the back of my drawer, buried under paperwork and old keys. I fastened it to my wrist that night and didn't take it off. It didn't fix things, but it reminded me why I couldn't stop. They could isolate me. They could lie. but they couldn't erase him or the promise I made to protect what he left behind. At the next HOA meeting, I showed up early. I sat in the front row this time. No flannel, no boots. I wore his watch, a dark jacket, and my calmest face. The room was quieter than usual when I walked in. Fewer smiles, a few stiff nods. Daryl Kinsley, the HOA board president, barely looked up from his notes. As they moved through the agenda, I raised my hand. I didn't speak, just waited. Finally, near the end, they opened the floor for community concerns. That's when one of the board members, Cheryl Pennington, the treasurer, stood up and addressed me directly. "Mr. Carver," she said, voice dripping with false civility, "we've received multiple complaints regarding your hostility toward our events and your refusal to engage in neighborly collaboration." I didn't flinch, she continued. "At this time, we are calling a special vote to review whether your property privileges, specifically trail access, lakefront participation, and HOA newsletter inclusion, should be suspended pending further review." Someone behind me muttered, "About time." I pressed record on my phone, screen down. Then Cheryl stepped closer, past the table, into the aisle, right up to me. "Maybe if you spent less time playing scientist and more time acting like a decent neighbor," she said, low and venomous, "you wouldn't be so alone." I smiled. Just a little. "Thanks," I said. "That's exactly the tone I needed for this recording." Her eyes flickered. The mask cracked. I left before the vote. It didn't matter what they decided. The state inspection was done. The report was filed. They were dancing in a house already wired to implode. But even knowing all that, walking through those streets still felt like exile. That week, someone spray-painted "loser" across the bottom of my mailbox. Another time, I found dog feces left deliberately on the trail I restored. They wanted me to break, but I had the watch on. And the lake wasn't just water. It was history, and it was almost time for it to speak for itself. The envelope arrived by courier, hand-delivered, signature required. It was flat, official-looking, stamped in blue ink. State of Redacted Environmental Protection Agency, Regulatory Compliance Division. Inside was a 5-page letter printed on heavy stock, with words that hummed with power. "Wetland evaluation complete. Effective immediately, protected status confirmed." The lake wasn't a playground anymore. It was a federally recognized wetland. The ruling was thorough, citing the migratory birds, the amphibian larvae, the rare plant clusters along the north bank. They used words like habitat integrity, environmental sensitivity, and critical aquatic corridor. They even mentioned the conservation clause from my grandfather's deed, calling it historically significant documentation of intended non-commercial use. And then came the hammer. All recreational activity must cease immediately. All artificial structures must be removed. All HOA-facilitated development is now classified as a violation of State Wetland Code 1 subsection C. A formal citation and fine will be issued. I read it twice. Then I read it again, slower. And when I looked up from the page, I swear the lake was quieter than usual. Like it, too, had taken a breath for the first time in weeks. 2 days later, the signs came down. The massive vinyl banner, gone. The dock they'd hammered together at the water's edge, disassembled, under state supervision. The floating fuel station, removed and tagged as a hazardous contaminant source. State-issued placards were posted at all access points. Protected wetland, no motorized vehicles, no commercial activity, state monitoring in effect. The HOA didn't say a word at first. They couldn't. They had no legal standing. Not after the citation was filed. But that didn't stop me from driving by their leasing office. The morning the state posted the public notice, it was empty. The cooler was gone. The clipboard sign-up sheets had been thrown into a trash bag by someone in a hurry. A few deflated lake floaties sat abandoned near the curb like forgotten parade balloons. I didn't stop, just drove by slow enough to see Daryl Kinsley standing on the steps, phone pressed to his ear, one hand on his forehead. His kingdom sinking. By week's end, the fine arrived. $7,000 for unpermitted development near a protected habitat, for soil disruption, for ecological interference, for noise level violations during nesting season. It was all retroactive. Every weekend event, every rented jet ski, every kid with a popsicle standing on a dock that never should have been there. And just like that, their whole summer, their shiny, profitable HOA-branded dream was turned inside out. It didn't even require a lawsuit. The lake did all the talking. That was the part that struck me the most. After all the yelling, the flyers, the slander, justice didn't arrive with a gavel or a courtroom. It arrived in the form of water samples and bird calls and soil chemistry, the quiet things they never thought to notice. They thought silence meant surrender. They never understood that silence was the lake's first language. Now it would never be touched again. A few neighbors tried to soften after the news broke. A woman with a golden retriever waved from across the road. Someone left a note on my fence that just said, "You were right. We didn't see it." I didn't need apologies. I had something better: permanent protection. The HOA couldn't vote this away. They couldn't outmaneuver state law. They couldn't petition the birds to nest somewhere else. They tried to claim it. They tried to pave over history. But the lake knew who it belonged to. And now, so did the government. It started with a headline: "Man Saves Family Lake from Greedy HOA." Right there on the homepage of the local paper. Below it, a photo of the lake at dawn, mist curling off the water like smoke from a sacred fire. The article was fair, detailed, and, more importantly, it got everything right. They told the story from the beginning: how my grandfather fought to keep the land free, how the HOA swept in with their banners and wristbands, how a conservation clause buried in the fine print flipped the entire plan on its head. They even interviewed Marcy and Walt, quoted them like experts, because they are. But what made the story spread wasn't the zoning language or the legal twist. It was the photos. Marcy had sent the reporter a gallery warblers mid-flight, salamander egg clusters glowing in muddy shallows, a great blue heron captured in that still, regal stance like it was carved from sky. The photos went viral. By the end of the week, I was fielding calls from regional news affiliates. A local environmental podcast invited me to speak. A city council member personally reached out and asked if I'd share my experience at the next municipal planning session as a model for how residents can defend natural spaces from exploitation. Their words, not mine. For a while, I didn't know what to say. I wasn't a hero. I was just a guy who read the deed, who paid attention, who remembered the promise someone else made decades ago, and decided not to let it slip through a bureaucratic crack. But I showed up. I stood in front of that city council, watch on my wrist, and spoke not like a lawyer, not like an activist, but like someone who knew what a morning by the water was supposed to feel like. I talked about my grandfather, about the blackbirds and the stillness, about how power doesn't always announce itself. It often just waits until it's needed. The room was silent when I finished. A few people stood. One council member wiped her eye. That night, the lake was quiet again. But this time, it wasn't defensive silence. It was sacred. Then the resignations began. Cheryl Pennington gone, citing health reasons. The board secretary stepping down to spend more time with family. Even Daryl Kinsley, the face of it all, sent out a community-wide email announcing his early retirement from civic duties. No one said the word scandal, but the weight of it was everywhere. And with every board member who stepped down, a piece of their narrative collapsed. The same neighbors who once called me uncooperative were now apologizing. Sometimes awkwardly, sometimes genuinely. A man I'd never spoken to before knocked on my door with a pie and a printed apology letter. A teenage girl from up the road asked if she could help clean the trail I'd restored. For school credit, she said, but I could tell there was more to it. And then something happened I never expected. A few neighbors offered to testify. They wanted to speak out about how the board had manipulated information, cut corners, lied about notices, faked easement maps. The truth had momentum now. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was fighting alone. I went down to the lake the next morning. No jet skis, no music, just birdsong and soft wind. A heron stood near the reeds, still, watching, as if nothing had ever happened. And maybe, for the lake, it hadn't. Maybe this was all just part of the test, to see if I'd remember. I sat on the bench and closed my eyes. This time, the silence was earned. Daryl Kinsley stood at the front like he always had, but the edges of him had frayed. His tie was loose. His hands shook when he adjusted the mic. "We'd like to begin with community updates and then move to open discussion," he said. But his voice lacked the usual certainty. Like he knew the tide had turned, but still hoped to fake confidence through the storm. I didn't raise my hand this time. No preamble, no ceremony. "I have something for the record," I said. My voice was calm, clear. The room quieted, like someone had cut the power. I stepped forward and placed a folder on the podium in front of Daryl. "In that folder," I said, "you'll find a certified copy of the EPA ruling, confirming this lake is now a permanently protected wetland. It's accompanied by the cease and desist order for any commercial or recreational development under HOA jurisdiction." He opened the folder with trembling fingers, skimmed the first page. His face lost color. "I also included," I continued, "the conservation easement agreement I signed last week. The lake and surrounding habitat now fall under permanent stewardship of the North Fork Land Trust." I looked up, let my eyes scan the room. "That means no one can build on it. No one can rent it. No one can touch it. Not today, not next year, not ever." A ripple moved through the chairs. A murmur. Someone clapped once. Unsure, then stopped. No one moved. Daryl looked like he wanted to speak, but nothing came out. I waited, gave him the chance. But there was nothing left for him to say. So I nodded, turned, and walked out, boots echoing off the hardwood floor. I didn't rush. I didn't smile. I didn't look back. Behind me, I heard paper shuffling, chairs creaking, the sound of a room unraveling. Outside, the air was cool and full of crickets. The moon hung low, reflecting off the waterline. The lake was calm again, restored, unclaimed, and untouchable. They had wanted to monetize it. I had made it sacred. They had tried to make it temporary. I had made it eternal. That night, I stood on the dock, not their dock, my dock, the one I rebuilt after the mess, and watched a single heron glide across the water, wings wide in silent triumph. The fight was over, and I had written the final line. The water is still again. No more jet skis, no dock, no banners flapping in the wind. Just the sound of breeze through the reeds, the distant tap-tap of a woodpecker, and the low whistle of a red-tailed hawk circling above. It's been 3 months since the final board meeting, since the last banner came down, since the state posted their final wetland preservation notice at the trailhead, encased in protective glass, stamped with the emblem of permanence. The lake doesn't feel tense anymore. It feels alive. I come down here every morning, same as always. I bring my coffee, sit on the same worn bench my grandfather built, and watch the day arrive across the water. Sometimes the mist hangs low. Other days, the surface reflects the sky so cleanly it feels like a portal. The bench still creaks when I shift my weight. He used to sit right here, weathered hands wrapped around a tin coffee mug, boots planted in the dirt, listening. I remember the way he'd nod slowly, as if the lake was telling him something he understood but didn't need to explain. I didn't get it then. I do now. Last week, a group of neighborhood kids walked the path, clipboards in hand, stopping to sketch birds in the tall grass. One of them waved to me like we'd known each other for years. They pointed when they saw the heron standing in the shallows and whispered to each other, careful not to scare it off. I smiled. A local elementary school reached out. They want to include the lake in their science curriculum. Nature field trips, seasonal observation logs, real conservation work. I said yes before they finished asking. There's something beautiful about that, turning a battlefield into a classroom, letting the next generation inherit not just a space, but a story. Sometimes I think about all the things that could have gone differently. If I hadn't found that clause in the deed, if Walt hadn't picked up the phone, if Marcy hadn't remembered what salamander eggs looked like in muddy water, if the right person at the EPA hadn't cared enough to come see for herself. But mostly I think about how quiet it got when everyone else was shouting, and how that silence held more power than anything they threw at me. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it listens. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes it wins. The trail is overgrown in parts again. I let it be. Nature's way of retaking what belongs to her. The lake doesn't need to be curated anymore. It just needs to breathe. There's no HOA newsletter anymore. No more maps with dotted lines pretending to divide what was never theirs. The land trust has full stewardship now. Their signs are small. Their policies are simple. Observe, respect, protect. I like that. The sun breaks through the clouds and hits the surface of the water, scattering gold across it. A family walks past behind me, whispering. Their little girl points to a turtle on the log, her voice hushed, reverent. This is what it was always meant to be, not an attraction, not a commodity, a living thing, and a legacy. They thought they could take my lake. Turns out, it's the lake that took them. Some fight with fists, others with forms. If you've ever been outnumbered, outvoted, or overlooked, this story was for you. Because sometimes, the quietest land holds the loudest truth. Stick around, we're just getting started. And the next story might just be yours.